I always thought my job as a housekeeper at this small motel was pretty chill, even with the occasional weird guests. The place is small, with cheap rooms, perfect for people who want to disappear for a few days without being asked questions. But everything changed when this guy started staying for weeks in one of the cheapest rooms, number 12. He was way too discreet, never let anyone in, not even for cleaning, and he'd only leave late at night. Sometimes, I'd hear footsteps in the room during the day, but he always kept the door locked when he wasn't there. My coworkers and I started calling him the ghost because no one could get a word out of him. I remember the first time he checked in. He paid cash and barely bothered to fill out the check-in form. Weird, but not unheard of. For weeks, he'd leave at night and come back in the early hours, always carrying this black backpack that looked heavy. Nobody knew what he was doing outside, and honestly, nobody wanted to ask. The sheets in his room started to reek of something strange, like he was smoking something unusual in there. But whenever I offered to clean, he'd just shut me down, cold and direct. The longer he stayed, the more uncomfortable I felt about that room. Something just felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. That particular night, everything seemed normal until 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot out of nowhere. The owner ran out from the office looking nervous and called me over. "It's room 12, he said quietly, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. My stomach dropped. The cops headed straight for the room, banging on the door hard and yelling that it was a police operation. My heart was racing because I knew the ghost was supposed to be in there. Or at least, I thought he was. They pounded on the door a few more times before finally kicking it in, but when they got inside, he was gone. All that was left was this eerie silence and a smell I couldn't quite place. I stayed near the stairs, trying to keep out of sight, but I could still hear the officers talking as they searched the room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through the open door. That's when I saw what they were looking at: disposable gloves, a ski mask lying on the floor, and a smashed-up phone. It wasn't just a messy room. It was something worse, like he'd cleaned up and planned this escape. I got chills because it hit me. He knew they were coming. As the cops searched the room, one of them came out to talk to the motel owner. I was close enough to hear bits of their conversation, even though I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The officer said the man had used a fake name and was wanted for breaking into a house nearby with some accomplices. They had held a family hostage while robbing the place. Hearing that made my stomach turn. I kept thinking about all the times I stood at his door, asking if he needed anything, and he'd just stare at me with this cold, empty look. When they were done, the owner asked me to help clean the room. I didn't want to, but I couldn't really say no. My hands were shaking the entire time. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a crime scene. Honestly, that's exactly what it was. The air felt heavy, like his presence was still there somehow. I noticed marks on the floor, like the bed had been moved, and that made me feel even worse. Everything about the room screamed that something was very, very wrong. And the fact that he had managed to vanish without anyone noticing, that just added to the unease. After that, the police asked to check the motel's security cameras, and the owner called me over to help organize the timestamps. When we looked at the footage, we saw the guy leaving his room the night before. Same backpack, same creepy calmness. He looked around like he was constantly expecting someone to pop up. The last thing we saw was him slipping out through the back of the motel, cutting across the empty field behind it. He knew exactly what he was doing. The days that followed were rough. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked past room 12, I got this weird chill down my spine. Sleeping became nearly impossible because I kept replaying everything in my head. I kept wondering, what if he came back? What if someone else like him showed up? The job that had been just routine before now felt like a constant state of paranoia. Every guest who checked in made me nervous, like I was always looking for signs they might be dangerous. The scariest part was knowing that he had been so close, for so long, and no one suspected what he was capable of. I mean, we all thought he was weird, sure, but nothing like this. Just the idea that someone like that could be so calm, so calculated, made my skin crawl. And then there was the thought of all those times I stood outside his door, not knowing what was going on behind it. The cops said he and his crew had hurt people, made them feel helpless in their own home. I couldn't stop imagining the fear that family must have felt, and it made me even more uneasy about how he'd stayed here like nothing happened. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit the job. It wasn't just the memories of that night or the fact that room 12 still gave me goosebumps every time I passed by. It was the realization that you never really know who's staying just a few feet away from you. The motel had always felt like a place for strangers, but this was different. It was like he had left a shadow over the place, and no matter how much I tried to shake it off, it stuck with me. Even now, I can't walk past a motel without thinking about him and wondering if he's out there, staying somewhere else, doing the same thing all over again. I never thought something like this could happen to me, but here I am, trying to put into words what went down that night. I'd been driving for hours, exhausted, and all I wanted was to find a cheap place to crash and start fresh in the morning. I came across this rundown motel on the side of the highway, the kind of place you know you should avoid, but fatigue overpowered my better judgment. At the front desk, a middle-aged guy in a stained shirt greeted me with a forced smile that felt more like a reflex than genuine friendliness. He didn't ask many questions, just took my payment up front and handed me the key to room 7. Before heading up, I casually mentioned that I wouldn't be going out that night, just so he'd know my car would stay parked. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a place like that. Musty smell, sheets that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, and an eerie silence broken only by the hum of a rusty ceiling fan. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just for a few hours. But around 10 p.m., my stomach started growling, and I decided to go grab some food, even though I had told the guy at the desk I wouldn't leave. I figured it'd be a quick trip to a nearby drive-thru. No one would notice. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the receptionist standing at the door, watching me. It felt odd, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was just tired and overthinking. When I got back about half an hour later, the place felt even creepier. The parking lot was nearly empty. The flickering reception light gave the building a haunted vibe, and something just felt off. As I parked my car, I noticed a dark vehicle pulling in slowly and stopping near the reception. 2 men got out. One was tall, wearing a hoodie that covered half his face, and the other was shorter, constantly glancing around like he was on edge. They walked into the reception, and every alarm in my body started going off. I killed the engine and stayed as quiet as possible, just watching. Through the fogged-up windshield, I could see them talking to the receptionist. They were pointing toward the rooms and gesturing a lot. Suddenly, the receptionist handed them something. It looked like a key and pointed directly at my room. My heart dropped. I sank lower into the driver's seat, trying to make myself invisible. The 2 men left the reception and headed straight to my room. One of them unlocked the door like he knew exactly what he was doing. That's when it hit me. They were looking for me. I don't know how I managed to keep it together enough to think straight. My first instinct was to stay as low as possible in the seat, praying they wouldn't look around and spot me. My eyes stayed glued to the door of my room. They walked in without hesitation, flipping on the lights. The taller guy seemed to be searching for something, while the shorter one was pacing, gesturing like he was frustrated. I didn't stick around to figure out what they were doing or hoping to find. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, quietly and fast. I turned off the car lights and, moving as carefully as I could, reversed slowly, praying the sound of the engine wouldn't draw their attention. My hands were so sweaty they kept slipping on the steering wheel. Once I reached the exit of the lot, I stepped on the gas and sped off. My mind was racing. Did they see me leave earlier? Did the receptionist tell them something about me? I drove straight to the nearest police station, trying to convince myself that I wasn't just being paranoid, that I had actually escaped something serious. When I got to the station, I was so shaken up I could barely get the words out. I told the officer on duty everything: the motel, the men, the key being handed over, and how they went into my room. He listened carefully, but the look on his face when I mentioned the motel's name sent chills down my spine. He exchanged a glance with another officer before asking me to wait while he checked on something. A few minutes later, he came back with a serious expression. "That place is already on our radar," he said. "We've had several complaints and know it's tied to criminal activity, but we're trying to gather enough evidence to shut it down." Hearing that made my stomach turn. He explained that there had been reports of robberies and even kidnappings linked to the motel, and that I was probably their next target. That's when it really sank in. I had dodged something incredibly dangerous. The officer took my information and said they'd contact me if they needed anything else, but he advised me not to talk about the incident until their investigation was complete. I thanked him and left, but the fear stuck with me. The idea that those men were after me, or worse, was hard to shake. I spent the rest of the night parked at a busy gas station, too scared to check into another motel. I kept the engine running and couldn't stop glancing at my mirrors, half expecting to see those men or their car show up out of nowhere. Even though I was technically safe, the panic didn't go away. I kept replaying the night in my head, asking myself over and over, did they see me leave? Did they know I wasn't in the room? Or were they waiting for me to come back? The next morning, as the sun finally came up, I managed to gather enough courage to hit the road again. The daylight brought a small sense of relief, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to something terrible. I still don't know exactly what those men wanted or how deep the receptionist was involved, but one thing's for sure, deciding to go out for food probably saved my life. If I'd stayed in that room like I planned, who knows what could have happened. To this day, I can't drive past a sketchy roadside motel without feeling a knot in my stomach. The thought of that night still gives me chills. My girlfriend and I decided to take a weekend trip to get away from everything. It was nothing fancy, just a quick getaway, so we tried to save some money and booked a cheap motel we found along the highway. We arrived in the evening, and the place looked pretty standard. One of those roadside motels you see in movies, with a flickering neon sign and an empty reception desk. After a minute or two, the receptionist showed up, handed us a key, and pointed us to a room at the far end of the building. It all felt a bit makeshift, but we were tired and just wanted a place to crash before hitting the road again in the morning. As soon as we walked into the room, something felt off. It wasn't dirty or anything, but there was this weird vibe I couldn't shake. The bed had a bright, almost tacky comforter, like they were trying too hard to distract from how run down everything else was. While I was unpacking our bags and hunting for a working outlet to charge my phone, my girlfriend started looking around the room, visibly uneasy. She pointed out that the large mirror on the wall seemed oddly placed, like it didn't belong there. I didn't think much of it, but she was determined to check it out, and after a few minutes of inspecting it, she turned to me and said, "There's something weird about this mirror." I walked over to see what she was talking about. She was gently knocking on the surface, and the sound was strange, hollow, like there was empty space behind it. Then she grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it along the edges. That's when we saw something that made my stomach drop. A faint glow, almost like there was a small gap in the frame. It hit us both at the same time. This wasn't a normal mirror. It was a two-way mirror, and there was definitely something on the other side. My heart was pounding, and my girlfriend immediately said we needed to leave. Trying to stay calm, I told her we should double-check before panicking. I grabbed a small nail I found under the bed and scratched the surface of the mirror. The way it scratched confirmed what we feared. This was no ordinary mirror. It felt like someone was watching us from behind it. My girlfriend was pale, clutching her bag as if she was ready to bolt out of there at any second. I was trying to act like I had everything under control, but my mind was racing. Who was behind that mirror? And even worse, were they watching us right now? We didn't waste any time. We stuffed our bags as quickly as we could and headed straight for the door. The hallway felt a lot creepier now, with a flickering light at the far end and an eerie silence that made every little sound echo. We made our way to the reception desk, but when we got there, it was completely empty. The receptionist had vanished, and the tiny bell on the counter just sat there, almost mocking us. My girlfriend clung to my arm, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds like she expected someone to come out of one of the rooms. We tried to stay calm and call the police, but of course, the cell signal was terrible. We ran outside to the car, desperate to get a better connection. Finally, we got through to 911 and explained everything: the mirror, the room behind it, and how the receptionist was now gone. The operator told us to stay in the car and wait for a patrol to arrive. My girlfriend was quietly crying by this point, mumbling that there must have been cameras watching us, recording everything. The idea made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. What could I even say? The cops showed up about 20 minutes later, but honestly, it felt like an eternity. When the patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, a few officers got out and started looking around. I explained everything to one of them, and they decided to check out our room first. My girlfriend refused to go back inside, so we stayed in the car while they investigated. After what felt like forever, one of the officers came back and asked us to follow him. He led us to a small room at the back of the motel, and when we walked in, I felt like I was going to throw up. The room was tiny, dimly lit, and filled with monitors and tangled wires all over the floor. Some of the screens were still on, showing live footage from inside the rooms. That's when it all clicked. They had hidden cameras behind the mirrors. I felt sick, like I couldn't breathe. The officers started collecting the equipment, and one of them confirmed our worst fear. They've been recording guests for a long time. Either they were live streaming it or saving the footage. We're not sure yet, but this isn't the first time they've done this. My girlfriend broke down completely, and I just stood there, frozen, thinking about what might have been recorded. After hours of investigation, the police told us the motel was part of a larger operation. The owners had been secretly recording guests for years and selling the footage online. They couldn't confirm whether the cameras were streaming live or just storing the recordings for later. One of the officers tried to reassure us, saying they would dig deeper into the case, but he admitted they couldn't guarantee our footage wasn't already out there. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. The thought of someone watching us, sharing our private moments, was unbearable. Once the police confiscated the equipment, they let us leave, telling us they'd contact us if there were any updates. We drove away in complete silence, still trying to process what had just happened. The highway stretched endlessly in front of us, and neither of us spoke for what felt like hours. To this day, we've never received any calls or updates about the case. We don't know if we were recorded, or if those recordings ended up online somewhere. It's a haunting feeling, living with that kind of uncertainty. Even now, I find myself obsessively checking mirrors whenever I stay in a hotel or Airbnb. I'll tap on them, shine a flashlight, even scratch the surface if I feel suspicious. My girlfriend refuses to stay anywhere that doesn't have a major brand name attached to it. That night changed everything for us. We'll probably never know the full truth, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. But one thing is certain, I'll never look at a motel mirror the same way again. My buddy Luke and I decided to save as much money as possible on this trip. The plan was to spend a few days hiking and exploring waterfalls, but without spending too much on accommodations. We found this remote motel in the middle of nowhere that seemed perfect on the website. Cheap, clean, and with a few decent reviews. When we arrived, though, things already felt off. The place was surrounded by thick woods, the parking lot was empty, and the whole vibe screamed abandoned. The receptionist was this older guy with a blank expression who looked almost surprised to see us. He handed over the key without saying much, just pointed us to a room at the end of the hallway. It was weird, but we laughed it off, thinking we were just overthinking. That first night, something felt off. It wasn't just the eerie silence. It was this feeling that the place was older and more run down than it looked in the photos. The window in our room faced the woods, and late at night, we heard footsteps outside. We didn't think much of it, assuming it was probably an animal. The next morning, though, when we stepped outside, we saw muddy footprints near the window and dark smudges on the doorknob, like someone had tried to force it open. We joked about it being old dirt, but it stuck with us enough that we mentioned it to the receptionist. He assured us the place was safe and said no one else was staying there except us. That was supposed to be comforting, but it just made everything feel even creepier. The second night, we were exhausted after spending the day hiking. We tried not to think about the footprints or the doorknob and convinced ourselves we were being paranoid. Around 2 a.m., though, we woke up to this faint but persistent sound at the door. It was like someone was fiddling with the lock. I froze for a second, trying to convince myself I was dreaming. But then Luke whispered, "Do you hear that?" My heart started racing. I got up slowly and went to the door to check through the peephole, but the hallway was completely empty. Just as we were trying to figure out what to do, we heard footsteps in the hallway. I looked through the peephole again and saw the manager standing there, staring at our door. I cracked the door open a little to ask what was going on, and he gave me this weird smile and said something that still gives me chills. "I thought you guys were leaving tonight?" Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away slowly down the hall. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I looked at Luke and said, "We need to get out of here. Now." After that, we couldn't think straight. We just knew we had to get out of there as fast as possible. We packed up our stuff in silence, trying not to make any noise, and slipped out of the room. The hallway felt longer and darker than before, and the silence was almost deafening. When we reached the lobby, it was completely empty. There was no sign of the manager or anyone else, just the sound of an old ceiling fan creaking as it spun. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though there was no one around. When we got to the parking lot, we saw muddy footprints on the concrete, just like the ones near the window. They led straight to our car. Luke fumbled with the keys, unlocking the doors as fast as he could, and we jumped inside. As I started the car, the headlights lit up the front of the motel, and there he was, the manager, standing in the doorway, staring at us. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with that same creepy smile on his face. We peeled out of the lot, and I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to start running after us. Even once we were back on the road, the relief we were hoping for never came. If anything, the tension just got worse. Every car that showed up in the rearview felt suspicious, like someone might be following us. Luke was just as paranoid, constantly glancing back over his shoulder. We decided to drive straight to the nearest town and only stop somewhere busy, with lots of people around. On the way, we kept replaying everything in our heads: the footprints, the doorknob, the manager's bizarre comment. None of it added up, but it all felt like some kind of twisted plan. When we finally reached a well-lit gas station, we parked and just sat there for a while, trying to process what had happened. Even surrounded by other people, it felt like we couldn't shake the uneasiness. That's when it really hit us. Who else would have had a key to our room besides us and the manager? And why did he say, "I thought you guys were leaving tonight"? It felt like we'd been targeted for something way worse than we'd even realized. I couldn't sleep for days after that, and even now, I still think about what could have happened if we'd stayed another night. If you enjoyed the stories, subscribe to the channel for more content like this and leave a like to support our work. Thank you.